multifaceted in the way in which we are expressing who we are and how we're seen by others. And it's that really fundamental social insight, accepting the reality that none of us are really atomized sets of characteristics that can be tucked in. 19 headlines like this were littering the news. And it was quite clear that, like the ProPublica studies before it that showed risk scores used in criminal justice systems meant for being able to predict recidivism to be able to replace a judge's making that decision, that the same sorts of challenges of building systems without attending to both intersectionality and systemic oppression will reproduce the kinds of biases that are circulating in the world. That it couldn't help but do that. So this is just a collection of the call out of this reality. Importantly, and let's break down what Obermeyer and colleagues found in their study of what later they revealed was Optum. What they found was that the algorithm was predicting risk scores for patients, but that there was this disparity between Black and white patients who were admitted based on this algorithmic risk score. And unless we would accept that there was some biological difference between the health of Black and white patients in some fundamental way, we have to account for why there would be such a difference in who's admitted. So when Obermeyer and colleagues dug into, and in many ways reverse engineered how the risk score was managed, it was clear the predictions, the modeling was including information about medical costs. It was using medical costs and basically who's admitted to a hospital as a prior for a proxy of medical need. Now, pointing that out in hindsight, it makes it seem quite obvious that that is why we had the disparity between the admission of Black and white patients. But Obermeyer was able to kind of recreate this bias by showing that Black patients should have been admitted more. And I would argue their correction at the end of the paper as a place that tends to strike the chord of fairness is perhaps not the place to stop. That in many ways they suggest new algorithms that are focused on health per year, total cost per year, and avoidable cost per year. Finding more information would somehow balance out and help correct this fundamental systemic oppression that Black patients face when they're not admitted to the hospital. In other words, there's a sense that on paper in modeling, you can greatly reduce this racial disparity by adding more information into the model. But the challenge of this is that it fails to account for what will always fall out of the model. So we're going to be perpetually searching for more and more information as a way of debiasing our models. But in fact, it never gets us closer to fully accepting that information isn't the source of the discrepancy. It is the actions of somebody making a snap decision about who's coming into the emergency room and who should be seen first, or who should be pushed to the bottom of a chart. So there's no system that isn't going to be constantly interacting with the presence of these other forms of tacit societal bias that are channeled through all of us as individuals. So my argument to you today, and I'm going to move more quickly because I want to make sure we get to discussion. My argument is, rather than continue to search for more information as a balance to the model, would be, let's shift to looking at how would we constantly build a model that is iterative and gauging the domain and subject matter expertise of people closest to that moment to be able to use our predictive models to surface what's the prediction one could make, and what is it that somebody could surface that tells them what bias they're working with in that moment. How would we use models to help us identify our biases? And then we can negotiate that bias, not try and override it with the system, but literally flood ourselves with that awareness. So what would that look like? I want to present to you what Project Resolve for me allows us to do by focusing on building a system that is closer to the subject matter experts who can constantly help us understand what is unfair about a system, who have the perspective that when we're just flooding a model with information is lost in the mix. So if you think about community healthcare workers, they have effectively become this translational bridge to COVID care. They are the ones that surface who's overlooked. More so than a model, they're constantly using their priors with the subject matter expertise they have to be able to fine-tune how they meet people's needs. So I'm going to make a case as I go, but the goal is not to scale past these community health organizers, these community healthcare workers, but rather to center their care in the thick of the support of a range of clients, but particularly those who are best served by communities who quite literally speak their language. For example, when we talked with a long-term healthcare worker, they noted in most cases, by the time somebody gets to a hospital, they might be able to tell you what somebody's labs look like. But as they said, they don't know that somebody's about to lose their house. It's that kind of subject matter expertise that a community healthcare worker brings to their analyses of whether somebody needs a bed or not. And in other cases, when we're talking with administrators, they're quite aware of the power of their position, their intersectionality with the clients, that their position as somebody who's been in the place of somebody calling for help makes all the difference in their ability to interpret the moment of need that is coming through the phone in this case. But whenever they're presented with somebody who's in need, that they're bringing another set of qualitative data to the table that can't be folded into a model. But the tools that are built for these community healthcare workers are not designed to support their relationships with these clients and with communities. And it took working with well over 14 different community organizations to be able to get a sense of what is the range of care that they provide across these intersections. So when we're listening to these community healthcare workers, we're hearing that they're actually operating on two different levels constantly. On one level, they're managing this case-centric care. They're caring for individuals in an acute moment of need, but they're also constantly thinking about a service level provision of care that's at the community level, where they're thinking about classes that are going to serve that client once they're out of a particularly acute situation. They're thinking about the advocacy that that person's going to need, and they're collaborating with other community-based organizations to meet that holistic care need that's quite literally taking in the intersectionality of the client, that it's not just an individual, it's a person in a setting who is part of a group and actually part of many identities as women or non-binary people who are people of color, who are undocumented, that it takes this level of detail of understanding the context of a person in need to be able to serve them fully. So one example of this kind of service-centric care that community-based organizations offer is through vaccine clinics, for example. They don't know who's going to come through the doors to receive a vaccine, but they do have a better sense than any clinic that's waiting for somebody to come in the door What kind of translation help will be necessary? Do they need to have more people who quite literally speak a different language or know the food and dietary restrictions and needs with particular religious groups? That is the kind of subject matter expertise these community healthcare workers can bring to the table, not to debias the experience of providing this care, but quite literally to be constantly iterating on what's the fine tuning of the care that's necessary in this situation. So their ability to do this work is sitting inside these larger sets of relationships with funders, certainly with clinical care in hospitals and with other community partners. They are negotiating and building this bridge to people who are otherwise excluded. They know, and we learned through this project, that they can't make any particular impact without being the ones who actually control the data that's collected about clients. So right now, most of the information they're building, the data we need to understand and build the trust with the clients who are most marginalized by society, are in need of tools that actually let them control and, to their argument, harness the power of learning from these clients every day. So I want to quickly show you a few screenshots of the things that we've built, because I don't think these tools are anything other than a first try at what it means to design with communities. And quite honestly, the shortcomings and constraints on doing that within an industry setting. So we've built with them to their spec to address their pain points, what kind of intake form would help them manage the data they need to both provide that patient or case-centric care and service-centric care. But it's built specifically to create relationships with their clients and with the other community-based organizations. The workflows that they have are most critical when it's 2 or 3 different community-based organizations that are serving different parts of different facets of a person's identity. For example, in cases where we were working with a community-based organization that serves women who are just returning citizens who are also new parents, being able to have that community-based organization work with another organization that specifically helps with food insecurity means that the broader needs of these individuals can be tended to. But importantly, the technology isn't going to scale past these social dynamics. It's the social dynamics of working in relationship to existing hospital systems that are not built for daily use by people who don't have a primary care physician. It's dealing with the social dynamics of different friction points between community groups that maybe sit side by side, but are divided by racism, by homophobia, by other forms of oppression that divide and conquer all of us. And these key dynamics are precisely what the community healthcare workers work with as they're navigating how to care for the clients who come to them in need of help. I would argue that we're designing differently and building differently. Again, hat tip to Sasha for thinking through what this could look like, and to all the scholars who are thinking about what it means to design with communities and with groups, setting the agendas. But it's going to look really different than what scaling is supposedly doing. It means not thinking about paying customers. It means literally thinking about the subject matter expertise of the clients themselves and the community groups in this case, so that we're not thinking that we're imagining what might be good for someone else, but quite literally asking them what are their needs, and more importantly, what are the solutions they're already incorporating into how they navigate these systems. So I want to give you a really clear example of how hard this is, because I see failure within the system we've built. We created categories for gender, for example, and we ended up reproducing the kind of binaries that are so typical when gathering data. The only thing that makes us, gives me any solace, having recreated the same possibility of producing biased data, meaning that it's only capturing a binary, is because we're in constant conversation with these community groups so that they can help us redesign this intake form and think about what is a meaningful structure to gender for their organizations. How can they collectively have the conversation about what categories of identity are important for them? And that includes the other categories that you see on this screen. Because at the end of the day, whenever we're collecting data, we're going to be reproducing categories. It's right now, we don't have a system and a way of thinking systemically about intersectionality. That's what I would bring to this conference, is how can we approach the mathematical need for identifying ways to model intersectionality. And perhaps it looks like a different kind of mathematics that isn't as attached to thinking about a quantitative, discrete category of identity. What would that look like? I want to make a case that it's modeling something I'm calling scaffolding. This is actually building on cognitive theories from the early 1900s around learning theory. That scaffolding rather than scaling might be a way of imagining how we either work with or move through the ways in which we create discrete categories. It looks specifically like using subject matter expertise to constantly be the source of course correction, and not toward finding all of the right information, but rather constantly bringing to our attention what and who are we missing. It's the subject matter expert. In the case of Project Resolve, that's community healthcare workers and community-based organizations who are in the best position to be able to collectively say, who are we missing? What dimension of humanity is missing from our care, from our analysis? But the piece I think is often left out that I want to argue as I'm closing out our conversation that we're missing is disciplinary domain expertise. That's what I love about this conference and why I'm so excited that you've convened it. Because to me, the most important thing we can be doing now is working as multidisciplinary teams that build bridges and broker power, and in many ways yield agendas to subject matter experts. How do we, instead of trying to have the CS expertise of software development, design, HCI, data sciences, security, economics, how do we, rather than have that domain, that subject or that domain expertise of CS just pass and connect to subject matter experts and miss the disciplinary domain expertise of social sciences? How would we instead be able to bring these different vantage points together to say they have very important perspectives that have to be put on the table toward the goal of prioritizing the identified needs and capabilities, to borrow from Sen, of the subject matter experts, so that we're constantly building with each other. And as importantly, acknowledging where there are power differentials that mean there is never a moment at which we're operating from an even playing field. That is an artifice. It's a liberal notion of liberation, that inequality that gets in our way from grappling with how hard it is to practice justice. So we should know that technology isn't going to create some systemic change in and of itself. But what if we were focused on building new relationships that were going to be this constant course correction, not with a particular goal in mind, but really the means of that relationship, the process of it being our objective. So with that, I want to thank the organizers, all of you. Special thanks to my colleague Elizabeth Federoff for their help with this presentation. And if you want to see the open source software we've built with community-based organizations, you can go over to GitHub, or I can send you this link. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. We are running a bit over, so we don't have too much time, but if there are any quick questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A and we will quickly read them. Just give it a second, just in case anyone is typing.
I hope my presentation actually went off. I didn't see the chat until just now, so I hope you saw that.
It was great. Yeah, it was great. This is leaves us with a lot to think about that we can hopefully start to talk through in the panel. So I think we can just move to the panel, which is the next scheduled event. So for the panel, we're going to have our second keynote speaker, Dr. Dirk Bergman, join us. Dirk is here. There you go. Okay, very good. I'm going to quickly do an introduction for Dirk, but we're going to do the full introduction later at the second keynote slot that you can find in the schedule. So Dr. Dirk Bergman is a professor of economics at Yale University. He also has a secondary appointment in computer science in the School of Engineering and in the finance in the School of Management at Yale University. Dr. Bergman is known to many of us through his foundational work in game theory, contract theory, and market and mechanism design. And I'm especially inspired by a lot of the work that he's done on data economies and data markets, which is sort of the kind of the flip side of what Dr. Gray had discussed in her keynote just now. Dr. Bergman has held many leadership positions that we'll mention within economics, both within Yale and also within the broader field, including Econometrica, American Economic Review, and many others that we'll mention later today. But for now, we'll stop here and say that we're very grateful to have you here, and we're very grateful to start this panel with you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Reddit, and thank you, Mary, for a wonderful talk.
Very good. So let's jump right into it. So there's a lot really that your talk it's got me thinking about, Mary, and a lot that your work has inspired me, Dirk. One thing that comes to mind is I think there's now this acknowledgement that there's a very deep need to include those who are marginalized themselves, and also those who are kind of working on the front lines, right? So you mentioned community health workers, social workers come to mind, public defenders, right? So there's a lot of individuals and communities that are doing a lot of frontline work. And I completely agree with you, Mary, that we're not necessarily systematizing how we include them in decision-making for those of us who are on the sort of algorithmic side of things. And often actually trying to connect with these communities is not a clear path, right? And so this is something that you're just gonna have to do kind of on your own. And I see that as a very deep problem, because I agree with you that that we need to include those voices, but when we do, it tends to be very ad hoc. And so from both your perspectives, Mary, having done this sort of for quite a while, and Dirk, I know your work has also been very inspired by all different types of stakeholders, but in the kind of intellectual space, you're closer to the computer science, economic side like I am. How do you see ways that we can try to systematize this and make it not one-off? What are the challenges that you see, and what opportunities do you see?
Maybe I could kick it off, because I would really love to hear both of you hear what you think might be constraints on this. But I feel like what I'm seeing is that because there is such a palpable lack of diversity in computer science and engineering and all of the kind of cognate fields, the first order of business is having different perspectives. And particularly when we're talking about systemic oppression, that means who is missing, who's been disadvantaged. Like the first order of business is, yes, they should be in the conversation. My concern is that I think we're starting, and this goes to your point, Reddit, that we're not being systematic and thinking there has to be rigor to what that diversity and inclusion looks like. And it's tokenizing. It's just flat out tokenizing to think, now I've got a scholar of color, so I'm set. Because there's no way in which any scholar, unless they're trained in that domain of expertise, would possibly have more to offer than anyone else. They're offering something different, which is the most important part. Like, you have to have a range of people in a room able to have a conversation to get out of one's own mindset. But that I think that critical piece that I've been looking for is, what is the role of the domain expert? And the challenges to me are making systemically the kinds of multifaceted, multidisciplinary teams means it would make no sense to go it alone. It should never seem like, gosh, this is hard, I need to go find a community group. The first order of business should be, who's the domain expert who understands these community groups and this problem, so that I would be able to have the expertise in communicating with those groups, so that we're not taking on the task of, I'm going to become an expert in all things, but rather I'm looking for the experts I'm missing, to have that kind of humility and conceit that no one person, or there's a few exceptions, you might be one of them, who can spend that much time learning the domain that they're trying to address. I actually think it's quite risky to do that. I think I'd rather, and I think the biggest barrier is actually the structure of the university.
Dirk, can you comment on that? I would love your thoughts on the structural issue within universities and departments like ours.
Yes. So there's a sense in which I agree, and I'm struck by Mary's comment, in the sense that in law schools we have quite a big movement of public interest law. That is, we have both courses as well as funds available that trains lawyers to work for the public interest. In schools of management, we have entire groups working on nonprofits. There are schools of public policies that clearly are meant to gather economists, political scientists, data scientists to work for public policy. I think there's sort of a surprising lack, or maybe it is because computer science is a relatively young, data science is a relatively young experience. There's a surprising lack, I would say, at the level of the universities to build out expertise in that area, of social computation. I think there's a big wave of open source software that was incredibly successful, still driving a lot of innovation, but somehow it hasn't found its way yet to social organizations. I'm struck by the lack of, use in some sense, or availability of tools at the local community level. Even if you think about local communities literally as towns and cities, they are in some sense completely underpowered and overwhelmed in terms of deploying data. And that's even more true than of underprivileged communities, where just securing minimal resources to build up a small system, of data gathering is absent. And that's maybe particularly true in the US. So in Europe, in fact, surprisingly, maybe the smaller Eastern European states, so Estonia, Lithuania, have a very different approach of making access to data, to computing devices for citizens available, and having the public sort of allowing digital transparency and access. And I think there's a big gap both in the education and in the structure, certainly at the universities, that would allow, basically an educational pipeline that would move students in this direction, equip them with the tools, and also, help community organizers, help community workers to likewise benefit from education in, do 2 or 3 steps in basic computing, basic data sciences. So language, for example, so let me stop with this last point. So language is often a requirement in colleges. I would think nowadays we should probably think of computing, coding as sort of a basic language requirement that really empowers a lot of people to do things. And we are nowhere near to sort of offer that to the community at the scale level.
May I pick up one thing, Ray, before we move on about?
Absolutely.
Because I'm seeing a few people in the chat talk about public interest technology, and this is not a well-formed thought. So this is what I love about a small conference, is that we can kind of think out loud together. I think one of the biggest challenges for a move in public interest technology, as it imagines it's like public interest law, is that public interest law is dealing with legal structures governance that is, in most cases, by definition, public already. And most laws are drafted in the interests of publics, even if it's private citizens. It has an imaginary of the public. Computer science and engineering, software development particularly, the hardest thing is grappling with the fact that it's born out of a commercial interest or a defense interest. But at the end of the day, the markets today around computing are saturated in market logic. It's how do I build something somebody will buy? And then maybe it'll be useful to the public as a charitable good. I believe that one of the challenges for building technologies for social needs is that we have yet to fully figure out a way to see at least not a secondary order of commercial interest and public interest, but rather see that and I hope the pandemic taught all of this, that public interest is best served by taking care of the public, and economies follow from a healthy public. Like we're this could be the lesson we take away from COVID, that in fact, we built systems and relied on proprietary commercial software to manage the pandemic, and it failed miserably because it was built for a different kind of case management, a commercial health interest rather than care as something that is a fundamental need and arguably a human right. So I think one of our biggest challenges is that the market logic that structures and incents innovation is I would argue, a hindrance to software development right now, because we don't have a way of building software without starting with that incentive to scale, which is really a market logic. You want more people to buy it faster is one way to think about it. But I'm maybe throwing that out because I know Dirk's on, and all of you can push back.
Let's dig deeper. I would love to discuss this idea of control, actually. So Mary, you mentioned this in the context of data collection and data sharing. Who gets to collect the data and guide the process of collecting data? And then once it has been collected, who owns and controls that data? This is something that I know both of you have worked on kind of from different angles, but I think actually pretty complementary angles. And so I would love to get your perspectives using health and maybe even COVID-19 as an example. What have we learned about what the challenges are here in terms of this issue of power and control, in terms of what kind of data we collect, how we collect it, what you mentioned, Mary, about when you collect data, you're reproducing categories, right? So how do you, make sure that the data collection process is evolving as we're kind of better understanding and trying to do right by all members of society, right? So how do you think about this process of control and data? What are the biggest challenges here, and what opportunities do you see to move things forward?
So maybe I can start with Mary's comment. Clearly, a lot of software development is driven by private companies who have sort of immediate goals in terms of scaling. But I think, we can think about what is missing in sense, or what makes software look so different in the moment from other parts of the economy, where we actually have established governance by the public that allows us to turn, private interest into something that is also of public interest. So, financial markets have, and it is widely agreed, have to have a public governance structure. There has to be transparency. There have to be public records so that there is a uniform price, that there is equal access and opportunity to trade on financial markets. So all of these principles, they're always fought over and contested and need to be sort of constantly secured and resecured. But I think in the public, we are clear that they're critical for a well-functioning and a socially efficient financial markets. I think what is striking is that in data markets so far, we have basically no federal governance. And I think the discussion that we're having now is, very timely, because you have seen now, even before the new government coming in, an interest from both Republican and Democratic side to find sort of, maybe for different motives, maybe for different interests, but nonetheless, there's an interest to say we need to think about what should be the governance. Sort of first step, California has made a step in terms of a Data Privacy Act. New York has a proposal that is being discussed, but at the federal level, there's nothing yet. And so I think when you mentioned in one of your last slides, technology and relationships, then that's true. But I think we also need to establish sort of a governance, and I guess part of the failures that we're experiencing and the lack of establishing, social resources for computing is that we don't have a governance structure. And I think we are about to see that being established, perhaps too slow, but it's not that we are not, completely guilt-free as scientists. So economists certainly haven't worked hard enough to sort of update their way of thinking about regulation to data and to information that is quite different from, from physical objects. And there is a way in which, given their significance and importance, computer scientists are also rather mute or silent in the public discourse at large, right? So there are very few. I think that's right. So that's the case. And so I think we have to push a little bit harder within our respective professions as well to contribute to the public discourse.
I could not agree more. Like, I think in many ways, can we, use our own practices as opportunities for reflection on what we would like to see in terms of how we work with people's data. And it's interesting because I think the lack of governance, the complete, utter absence of regulation is it is noteworthy. Like, what other industry is allowed to innovate at this pace without accountability to society? I mean, I think of governance as fundamentally a way of assuring, or at least putting in place, a system for calling out accountability and responsibility.
Yeah, and have transparency and guardrails. That's right, exactly.
100%. And I think the toughest thing, and actually the thing that leaves me most optimistic if I look around this Zoom room, is like, okay, we're early days, and we know that governance is critical for being able to have the systems of accountability that are going to really be of most use to society, that we need that governance function. I think the argument I would make now, based on the research we've been doing around Project Resolve, is that so often in governance, we leave out community actors, and they've been so effectively marginalized. And actually the pandemic was just a box seat to the dismissal of the subject matter expertise of community groups. Mm-hmm. So for example, in the state of North Carolina, and as this was common in most states felt like we need to figure out contact tracing. How do we do that? Mm-hmm. It literally was so common to work with what was procured software and who was the private company already in place who could provide contact tracing, even though in most cases that meant a person who might have been recruited to do contact tracing by phone had none of the language skills necessary to be calling anybody. Like, some basic things were missing, mostly because they started from what's already an existing commercial contract the state has with a private company to do this healthcare work. And it took such utter failure and gaps in vaccine distribution for cities to finally say, who are the community groups who actually work with these individuals who need vaccines? Let's just work with them directly. And it was done not with this recognition that these are the best people for gathering data, are the folks who actually have the clearest sense of how would you find somebody who's housing insecure when they need their second dose of a vaccine. That there are community-based groups who are really well positioned for that. But importantly, that is necessary, not sufficient. That right now, community-based organizations become really the weakest link to securing data they collect. They know the data they collect, they don't have the technologies and the support systems to manage the data they collect. So what do? They literally don't keep it. They become pass-throughs. They will enter information into state legacy systems in most cases, and they will not keep the data because they know that it's going to be a liability for them and for their clients if they have names of people, and particularly for undocumented, for community-based organizations that work with undocumented workers, they literally lose the data, the value of the data they could be collecting, because there is no effective mechanism for them to manage it. That is actually something we could technically solve for if we wanted to empower those community-based organizations to be the data trust. That's why I'm so excited about the other speakers for the conference. It's like being able to position community-based organizations to be the trusted stewards is of value to all of us. And it is yielding and positioning them to be those power brokers that has so much potential. And it's also clear that is the place that those empowered do not want to go, because it's unnerving to imagine you have to ask for something you otherwise have been able to just take.
I love that comment, Mary. So we will need to wrap up soon. So I just want to ask one quick question and get your thoughts, both in terms of increasing governance and accountability, and what you mentioned, Mary, just now around what are the things that we can build and do in order to sort of increase the sort of control that these frontline workers and community organizers and community members have as members of this sort of ecosystem, right? So I wanted to ask, a lot of the conference attendees here are, majority of them are kind of junior researchers, right? In computer science and economics, operations research, sociology, public policy, that kind of space. And we also have attendees who are practitioners in various spaces, but especially, focused on sort of the more junior members of this conference. What are the things that we could be working on, both in our research and also advocacy, in order to kind of shift around who controls these data sets, right, and who controls sort of the process by which they're collected, and increasing accountability and governance. So both the research aspect of it and the advocacy aspect. What are the advice that you'd be willing to share for our conference attendees?
Well, the first thing I want to say is it should be hard to work with groups that you've never worked with before. So I think one of the most important things for all of us to take away, if you're an emerging scholar earlier in your career, is to both take heart that you're doing something quite different than what your established scholars are doing and have been I don't have a nice way to put this. that basically, established scholars are allowed to divorce themselves from the kinds of social problems that are now in front of us all. And I would say, my advice to emerging scholars who are at the intersections of these fields of inquiry, that want to understand how would you build systems that both incent everybody to be thinking about multiple stakeholders and constantly calculating the risks and benefits to these different stakeholders. The way to shore up your tactics for this are to recruit colleagues who have complementary domain expertise. So rather than feeling like you have to be the lone soldier here and fighting this fight, the most important thing, and Reddy can tell you this, like that means sitting down before you have a problem to solve and thinking, okay, we want to understand the shape of problems. So I actually think it's really critical for emerging scholars to be thinking, you've got this very particular domain expertise. It is not about stepping aside and seeing how do I have actors who are fighting every single day trying to get work done. How do I hand them the keys? That's not a genuine open-handed gesture. It's how do you wedge your body as a domain expert and keep the door open for subject matter experts who are based in community organizing, who are fighting very specific problems. How do you keep the door open for them to be able to bring in their expertise and help you support what they're doing to identify what is their agenda? What is it that they see as a problem to solve, rather than trying to imagine what is the best problem for you to solve? That actually takes a ton of practice. And the last thing I'll say is like volunteer. Don't do anything before you've volunteered for an organization that has a problem you would like to solve, because until you've had enough exposure to what that problem looks like, it'll be impossible to have an ongoing conversation to be able to address it.
Thank you so much, Mary. Dirk, any final thoughts?
I guess Mary made it sound a little bit tough, and certainly, you shouldn't. It shouldn't be easy, and you shouldn't expect it to be easy. But on the other hand, I think I would also encourage you, especially since we have such an international audience, right? So abroad, and meaning that widely, things are often a little bit more fluid. Smaller groups are often a little bit more perceptive to establishing a new database, solving new problems. So the immediate impact that your research can have can be much higher. You can address a problem that all of your senior colleagues haven't thought about it, and it's not merely an extension, but it's really making a step forward. And there's of course lots to be also gained in terms of knowledge from the interdisciplinary act. So certainly don't go it alone, but I think, as a citizen of your society, of your community, even before you think about an organization, you're aware of issues. COVID certainly showed it that, the communities, there was very few innovation in some sense, the community level, so there were lots of constraints on the community level to actually address contact tracing or anything of that sort. And most local at the state level efforts sort of didn't go very far, and sort of there's clearly a big breakdown there. So I think, in economics, for example, we made huge progress in school choice, school matching, and that often started very small and very modest. And looking at one small city that had a little bit of an odd procedure, and that we can improve. So I think there's receptions from the institutions, from the community. So with a little courage, I think the return can also be quite sufficient. So I want to be a little bit more encouraging, perhaps.
Yeah. I'm so glad you said that, Dirk, because it's true. Like this is going to we're just at the beginning of having a profound impact. And it's very exciting because we can do quite a bit if we will just shift our focus a little.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both so incredibly much. I loved your talk, Mary, and loved your comments. And Dirk, I loved your comments, and I'm very excited for your keynote today at 2 p.m. Pacific. So whenever that is, in less than 2 hours. So anyone, whenever time, what is time? So in just under 2 hours, everyone, please join us for that. And we're gonna take, we started late, so we're a bit pressed for time, but we're gonna take a few-minute break. Let's say 3-minute break, and we're going to come back for a panel that will be led by a policy and practice panel with a Latin American focus. That will be led by Christian, I believe. So come back in about 3 minutes. After the panel, we'll have a long break, and definitely come back also for Dirk's keynote to learn more about this topic at 2 p.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all so much.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Reddit. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
Hi, Andrew. Can you see me?
Yes.
Oh,